Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for hanging in there on the final afternoon of the Global Energy Forum. I'm Jennifer Gordon. I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And I want to first introduce my panelists, but then I'll also say just a few words to frame our conversation for today. So first we have Jeffrey Merrifield, who is a partner at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman LLP. We have Rumina Velshi, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. We have Nobuo Tanaka, who is the Chairman of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And finally, David Scott, who is a Director at ENEC and TerraPower and also an advisor to General Atomics. And I know these introductions were very, very brief, but you should also have their full bios on your app for the conference. So, a few words about the issue brief that you have on your seats. At the Atlantic Council, we have two basic art forms. We have the issue brief, and then we have the longer report. And so an issue brief is really intended to be short. It's no more than 6,000 words, and that's actually true in this case. And it's meant to just present one very discrete topic and give an overview of some of the considerations within that topic. So it's not meant to be a deep dive or anything exhaustive. But the truth of the matter is, in my mind, international regulatory harmonization is really the one side of the coin, and then you have nuclear co-financing as the other side of the coin, and you almost can't talk about one without the other. So for this to be an issue brief that only talks about co-financing, I feel like we're really missing the other half of the story, which is one of the reasons why we were so thrilled that Rumina Velshi was willing to come here and speak to us today. So I'd like to kick us off with a question for Rumina, which is, please tell us, what is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission doing as Canada's nuclear regulator to help support nuclear innovation in Canada and internationally? And we'll have to share microphones.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me?
Should be. You don't have to do anything.
Oh. So before I start answering that question, let me just give you a little bit of context around what's happening in Canada when it comes to nuclear. Currently, about 20% of the electricity in Canada is supplied by nuclear. And going forward, that number is likely to remain the same or maybe increase. So depending on which part of the country you're in, the amount of electricity from nuclear varies. Ontario, our largest province, for instance, has 18 reactors, and over 60% of the electricity comes from nuclear there. And as the country looks at where we want to be when it comes to 2050, there's recognition that nuclear will continue playing a significant role in the country. And so many of our reactors are going through life extension right now. They're getting refurbished to extend their lives by 30 years or so. But there seems to be increased interest in small modular reactors and the role that they could play. And as regulators, we have made the decision that our job, while it is to protect the public from risk, it's not to prevent innovation from happening. And so we want to be in a state of readiness when it comes to the deployment of new technologies, such as SMRs. So at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, I'll highlight some of the things we're doing to be ready for the potential deployment of SMRs, either domestically or internationally. One is our regulatory framework. And Canada's is, I wouldn't say it's unique, but in some ways it is rather special. Ours is a performance-based regulatory framework, so it's not prescriptive. We leave it up to the licensee or the vendor to come and demonstrate to us how they're going to meet the requirements, as opposed to us specifying this is what you need to do. We also offer a vendor design review process. So it's a pre-licensing process where a vendor can come and it's a three-phased process where they can come and walk us through their designs, make submissions, and we can identify if there are any showstoppers and help them get ready for the licensing process. So it's an extremely useful process, both for the vendor to understand how licensing is going to evolve, as well as for us as the regulator to better understand their technology. So currently we have 12 different designs going through a vendor design review process. We're also one of the few regulators, probably like the FENAR here at the UAE, where we regulate safety, security, and safeguard aspects. And what that helps is us coming up with integrated requirements where a vendor doesn't have to go to different regulators or approval authorities, and it just helps for making for a more efficient review processes. And so our regulatory framework, we actually had an international peer review done recently in September by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and was identified as a best practice for other regulators to emulate when it comes to being ready for new technologies. So clearly, the whole regulatory framework is one part of readiness. The second one is making sure we've got the right expertise and capability to review these different technologies. And so over the last few years, we've been doing a tremendous amount of renewal of our staffing because our demographics are quite challenging. The third is around public trust. Currently, and certainly around communities where we have nuclear facilities, there's a very high level of acceptance for nuclear power. And polling has shown that there's more than 80% support, or at least openness to SMRs as a potential in lieu of fossil fuel. And so making sure that, especially if you're going into communities that have not had nuclear power, we need to build confidence in the public. So there's a fair bit of activity around there. And the last one I want to leave you with is around international collaboration. We know that in order for us to make sure that we're being efficient, and as we look at what is it that is required for SMRs to be successful, and the expectations of the regulator, it's certainty, predictability, and efficiency, minimize the regulatory burden. And one of the ways we feel we can do this very well is if we were to collaborate more with our international partners. And in the paper that you have distributed, there is mention of the Memorandum of Cooperation between Canada and the USA, which was a major milestone where we agreed that we would share each other's technical reviews, not duplicate efforts, make it easier for the vendor, but also for us, and at the same time improve safety. So I think those kind of touch on some of the big things that we're doing. We have already got a license application for an SMR for a microreactor, a 15 megawatt one, and are expecting another one later this year. So we're ready, and I think we've got all the essential building blocks in place.
Wonderful. So you're ready. And Jeff shares, I think, some of your perspective as a regulator, as a former regulator. What can the U.S. do to also be ready and ready to export? And what are the challenges right now that we're facing that we may need to, overcome in order to be ready to export?
Well, first of all, like Ramina, I'll put it in the context. I think that the U.S. nuclear industry is healthy. There have been reports of some older plants that are less economically productive shutting down. But like Canada, the United States continues to have 20% of its power produced by nuclear. I think there's an increasing recognition that serves an important role in clean energy, and I think the tenor of this conference has really picked up the importance of nuclear in fighting global climate change. When you look at the advanced reactors in the U.S., that is a very healthy and I think very exciting area we have right now. One of the things you really have to think about when you talk about what are the tools you need for countries to develop and deploy nuclear power plants, people go to the financing, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but at the end of the day, you really need to have the right products, right? You got to start with the product, and you need to have strong government support. In terms of products, we do have existing large gigawatt-size reactors. The Westinghouse reactor, the AP1000 is out there. Now, there have been some challenges with a couple of those units being built in the United States, but there are 4 of them that are operating in China at 2 sites, Sanmen and Haiyang. And I think we will see within the next couple of years several more of those completed in the state of Georgia. But even more importantly, we have a round of new small modular reactors The NuScale reactor is expected to be licensed later this year. GE has a 300 megawatt small boiling water reactor design, taking many of the design elements of a previously NRC licensed design that will likely be licensed in a very quick period of time. And then over 20 developers of advanced reactors ranging in size from 2 megawatts up to 500 or more are in various stages of being ready for license review and early licensing activities. Companies you're going to hear about like X-Energy, Terrestrial Energy, Kairos, Oklo, which is a very small reactor that the NRC will begin licensing this year. So I think there's going to be a lot of products out there in various sizes. What that's going to drive is an opportunity for many countries which are not nuclear participants to have reactors more appropriately sized for their needs. They're going to be available over the course of the next decade. The second element that's important is government support. And having been in Washington on and off for the last 30 years, I can tell you the degree of enthusiasm in a bipartisan way for advanced reactor technologies, plus the support that the industry has been receiving from President Reagan, from President Trump, is extraordinary. I use as an example the 2020 appropriations language that went through just before the first of the year. That funds $1.49 billion for nuclear energy activities, the largest it has been in decades. $230 million of that is directed towards the deployment of advanced nuclear technologies. $160 million of that is specifically dedicated towards 2 demonstrations of advanced reactor technologies this year. And that's for early phase funding, and we match 50-50 by the developers. That's a very exciting development, and it's going to bring that product forward. Well, that brings you to the financing elements. We've had a lot of challenges over the last 10 years with Ex-Im Bank. That too was addressed in the appropriations language. Last year we were finally able to have a quorum of the Ex-Im Bank, which had been missing since 2014. The appropriations bill extended the authorization of the Ex-Im Bank for 7 years. They are open for business. They also have the authority under this new language that if they lose their quorum of having a sufficient number of directors, they will still be able to operate and lend money. So that's an important tool. We saw an example. They recently financed a $5 billion project in Mozambique for LNG. Those very same capabilities are now available, and Ex-Im has made it very clear that their dedicated team of nuclear experts is out there and ready to begin lending on nuclear projects going forward. The final element in financing, and you do pick this up in what is a very good report, which I would highly recommend you all take a chance to go through, is the transformation of what was the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. About a year and a half ago, Congress passed something called the BUILD Act that took OPIC along with other elements of the U.S. Trade Administration, put that all together and created an organization which has the capability of having about $60 billion in overall financing capabilities, a portion of which that language allowed to be equity financing. So when you look at those two combined, there's significant U.S. assets for nuclear which were not available to us 5 years ago. Now, I would put a caveat on it. Earlier OPIC language dating back to the Obama administration did put some limitations on lending on nuclear. The Trump administration has signaled they're going to be making some changes to pull that back. That will hopefully have an impact on other international financing institutions, which did also have limitations on nuclear lending, the World Bank being one, Asian Development Bank being another. And I think there are a number of us within the nuclear community who are working hard right now to try to repeal some of those provisions and allow folks to use those international institutions for nuclear lending, recognizing that the real game changer is climate change and the recognition that nuclear does need to be part of the solution to that issue.
Great, thank you. So talking about the exports and the institutions that are meant to facilitate the exports, I think then leads us to the next question, which is, where are we exporting to? Who's buying nuclear energy technologies? So, Nobuo, can you address what are steps that Japan is taking to export advanced reactors, especially to third-party countries? And what countries do you think have the greatest potential as purchasers of advanced reactors?
Yeah, thank you very much for the good question. I have to start with what's happening in Japan after the Fukushima accident. Unfortunately, of this tragic, serious accident, still 9 years has passed. But if you take a poll about nuclear power, 60% of the Japanese public are against restarting even the current reactors. We have 48 operable reactors, only 9 has just started operating. So the public opinion against nuclear is so strong. And Japanese government is certainly supporting the restarting because we are wasting $20 billion a year by importing gas and oil and coal to compensate this shutdown. But public is so negative. And also, to my surprise, the IEA, International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol's place, has announced 2 years ago that solar photovoltaic will be the cheapest source of the new energy in many countries in the future. So nuclear may not be competitive in the coming years, especially in the current big light water reactor paradigm. So Japan, we have been promoting nuclear by saying nuclear is clean, no CO2 emission, it's safe, and it's also very cheap. So this argument, all of them are no longer convincing argument for the Japanese public. So we need totally different argument or narrative to convince public. So my thinking is maybe, and also promoting the idea of the passive safe issues for the new advanced reactors, and maybe necessity for the proliferation resistance. Because of the North Korean peninsula Korean situation, force us to think about the nuclear issue as a defense. So military application, of course, Japan is not interested in having a weapon because we are the victim of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We cannot have weapon, but nuclear is a very national security or military implication is huge, thanks to the missiles over Japan from North Korea. So when we think about this nuclear technology in the future, proliferation-free or proliferation resistance is really important. The Iranian case strengthened the argument. Saudi Arabia is looking at the possibility of having a nuclear weapon if Iran has a weapon. Israel has already have a weapon. So for thinking about the peace or stability of the region, or as well as Middle East, as well as Northeast Asia, this proliferation resistance technology is a very, very important feature. So if any country, just as your question is, any country wish to have the nuclear reactor in the future, it should satisfy the safety issues and proliferation resistance issue, and possibly the cost. Are there any reactor like that? This is a very difficult question. We have to admit to build the new big light water reactor, PWL or BWL, are probably prohibitive. I don't think Hitachi gave up building one in UK. I don't think it is very, very, it's not almost impossible to build a new big light water reactor, even to replace the old one. Luckily, UAE has already completed or on the way. Even China probably cannot build the new reactors as they planned. They will complete the construction, of course, and the construction ones will be completed. because the cost of renewable is getting so cheap, there's no need for building a very costly and risky big light water reactor. So my argument is small modular reactor, just as Romena said, which is safe, passive safe, and proliferation resistant technology is probably the only future of the nuclear. And we have one. That is American technology called integral fast reactor, which GE Hitachi is developing as PRISM, or ARC is a kind of technology which may give a good future of proliferation resistance as well as passive safety. I don't want to get into too much detail, but that kind of argument. And in Japan, this advanced reactor system may be used for solving the meltdown debris of Fukushima, separating plutonium and uranium and burn it and reduce toxicity and volume of the waste. You know, we don't think the kind of solution for Fukushima debris as Chernobyl is impossible. We should take out meltdown debris and take care of it somehow. Otherwise, cementing for 300,000 years, Fukushima people will not accept. So this technology can be tested in Fukushima. And in Sasakawa Peace Foundation, I calculated what the cost for this, about 33 billion US dollars, and not big deal. We are spending 10 billion a year to decontaminate Fukushima. So 3 billion is just nothing. So testing it in Fukushima, if it works for debris or spent fuel solution, maybe it could be deployed other part of Japan. That is my idea. And for the sake of other countries, maybe I want to, Korea is very interested in this technology. Already, Korea is working with Idaho National Laboratory, aiming at this year for the pilot processing and fast reactor system. Japan finally come to agree with United States. MOU was signed between two countries to develop to make a research on this kind of reactor, versatile test reactor on IFR. So Japan has long been aiming at collaboration with France for Astrid or whatever, but now we have changed course with US on this technology, small modular fast reactor as a very interesting option for the future. So this reactor, if it can be developed by Japan, US, and Korea, could be an interesting model for the passive safe and proliferation resistant technology, and even take care of the spent fuel. So my very strong view is that by testing it in Fukushima or in Canada or in anywhere, if this kind of small modular type works, I think this is the future of the nuclear and collaboration in any country, Saudi Arabia or Iran or even North Korea if they give up weapon. We have to develop this kind of technology to save the future of the nuclear power.
Thank you. So before we get to Dave and a conversation about the private sector, I'd like to turn back to Jeff briefly. Jeff, I know that you were just in Africa, in Kenya, where 12 different countries in Africa expressed interest in acquiring civil nuclear technologies. So could you share just a little bit about that?
Yeah, and thank you very much. And I think it's a good demonstration of where the market is. And I think I might disagree a little bit with Nobu. I don't think we're completely at a point where the gigawatt-size market is over. We have a lot of Pillsbury works on projects all over the world. And we know of a number of projects out there in that range. But I think that the period where that is the sole focus of the nuclear industry is clearly over. But looking at what was happening in Africa, it was a conference that was put together, about 200 participants. There were 12 different African countries, sub-Saharan African countries that were represented at that conference. It was in Nairobi. Very interesting framework of the level of interest that is out there. And I think in part, there are some larger companies, obviously South Africa, which currently has 2 nuclear operating reactors, Nigeria, which is looking at 1,000 megawatt reactors, Morocco, which is looking at 1,000 megawatt reactors, and those are countries for which Russia and China clearly would like to market their reactors. But there are a number of smaller countries, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Uganda, all of which, I should add Namibia as well, all of which are looking at either small modular light water reactors or are beginning to kick the tires on some of the advanced reactor technologies that are out there. So I think this really, to me, demonstrates that the nuclear market is changing. It's not just a small group of countries that can afford to put very large reactors on their grid. The burgeoning advanced reactor market with a diversity of sizes means that a much larger number of countries out there who currently do not operate nuclear power plants can begin to think and evaluate these technologies and potentially deploy them in the next decade to decade and a half. So I think it's a very exciting time, and I do think the transition towards advanced reactor technologies will continue to accelerate as we get later into the 2020s.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot about what governments can do to facilitate the export of nuclear energy technologies. But I want to turn to Dave and talk a little bit about the private sector. So how can businesses work together to co-finance and coordinate on nuclear financing? And then also, what do businesses and what does the private sector need from governments?
Great. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to come and speak on this topic. I think some of what I'd answer in that question has been said somewhat. I think some of the solution from the private sector is engineering focused. And this has to do with the product. We need a product in the future in the nuclear industry that can do things like load following. We recognize that renewable energy and its part in the utility sector is growing, not shrinking. And so that means the technology is going to need to evolve to accommodate that. Also, I believe we have to get to a better economic outcome in terms of the cost of power that's delivered. And so that's also an engineering issue, and somewhat related to engineering, but also related a little bit to marketing, which I'll touch on in just a moment, is also avoiding the major first-of-a-kind disasters, right? The industry, every time it embarks on a new project that turns into a first-of-a-kind disaster, it shoots itself in the foot. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, and maybe talk about a couple of them in just a moment, but I traditionally talk about that as parties going out to deploy paper reactors. They're just not mature enough designs. And they sell a utility on a set of economics and a timeline for construction that is undeliverable. And then when the project turns around and actually has a poor commercial performance, the whole industry takes a hit. And so I think as somebody that's in the industry, including companies that are developing NSSS systems, I think there's an ethical question here about how do we market ourselves and how mature are we when we market those designs. So that gets to the question about how do we co-finance. I do think there's a lot of room for collaboration between utilities, right? Because as a practical matter, and based on my sort of own firsthand experience, developing a new reactor technology is about a $4 billion deal, right? It's not cheap to do. And it's very hard to imagine getting that money back if you're selling them and getting licensing fees in the neighborhood of $60 to $80 million per unit. You have to sell a lot of units to get that money back. The only way to get there really is to split that expenditure over multiple parties. So I think NSSS suppliers working together, a la GE Hitachi, is a pathway forward, particularly as we look at advanced reactor design, because we're going to have to expend that money to get the industry to be competitive again in that space. And I think also on the marketing side, right? We need to market ourselves better as it relates to climate change. And I know whenever you talk to somebody in the nuclear industry, they say I always talk about how it reduces carbon. But as a practical matter, if you look at marketing materials from the renewable energy industry and you compare them to marketing materials from the nuclear industry, their game is about 10x what our game is, right, in the nuclear industry. So we have to get better at that. And then you ask, what do they need from government, right? If you go back in the history of nuclear power in the United States, in the UK, in France, you will notice one common factor, that government was involved in the deployment of initial technologies. They were a big funder. They de-risked those sort of first-of-a-kind activities. And look, fast forward today, what are the big exporters today of nuclear technology, the most prolific? The Russians right now, the Chinese are threatening to become very prolific at that, and the Koreans. And they have a common thing. The government's still very much involved in the development of their reactor technology. And so I think one of the things that the industry needs is it needs government involvement. And then the other thing is governments need to recognize the positive externalities of nuclear technology and treat it just like they do all other technologies that have positive nuclear or positive externalities, particularly as it relates to climate change. We provide all kinds of tax incentives and programs for wind and solar and in some cases hydro, and then we turn and we say, oh, well, nuclear technology, we can't give that kind of a benefit to that technology. And that's simply bad economics, right? That's you know, a classic example of not adequately funding a positive externality. And so I think that's something government could do, is take a position that you will remunerate the industry for those kinds of things. So those are some thoughts related to your question.
Great. So I think I'd like to open this up now to the floor for any questions. I believe there may be some questions among some of you. Yes. And for the video, I think we're going to try to pass the microphone around.
Thank you. I think one of the advantage of SMR that could be produced or practically mass produced, have multiple reactors at the same time produced with 13 or 14 design review under the CNSC. I think that's mean we may have a lot of first of the kind, which will eliminate any economical benefit from this one. Then what about the industry? Do you have an agreement on some model and deployment model for this? It's because you cannot really construct 13 different first of the kind. You need to concentrate on 1 or 2 or 3 technology, and then you make the deployment, you prove the concept, then you will have the investor investing in this.
Clearly, you're a regulator. So that truly is a challenge that we have. With 12 designs that we're reviewing, we can only take them that far. And the discussions we're having both with government and industry is you need to shortlist this for us to be able to prioritize our resources. And what's happened in Canada, and it may be applicable to other parts of the world, Canada's doing this rather systematically. They've got an SMR roadmap that was developed in consultation with all the stakeholders. And applications for SMRs vary. So it's for on-grid with 300 megawatt times whatever number of units, to micro-reactors for our remote communities, to maybe something in between for resource development, like in mining, for instance. And so they do see potential for multiple designs, maybe 3, maybe 4. But also, in light of what Jeff said, that some are needed earlier, some maybe later, so maybe the advanced reactors will come maybe in the 2040s, but there is an immediate need from the mid to the late 2020s. So there definitely is a plan to shortlist the 12 to maybe 3 or 4, pretty much in the next 6 months or so, within the next 6 months, because you're exactly right. We cannot plan, never mind building, because I don't think we'll build that many, but even doing the licensing reviews of so many designs. So that is part of the plan to shortlist to 3 or 4 soon.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some of that going on. Certainly in the U.S., because the Congress is funding 2 particular designs, you'll have some alignment there. But in the end, I think part of it's going to be market-driven. I mean, because we work with a number of these developers. I chair an association task force on advanced nuclear. I think the number of those will whittle down somewhat on their own, because I think the finance community, the buyers, will evaluate those designs and ultimately recognize some of them are just paperwork reactors and don't have the wherewithal to move forward. So I think some of it will be government reduction, some of it will be market forces, which are appropriate. I think there's a couple other things about these reactor designs that's important to keep in mind. First is, I do think that manufacturing in a factory environment is going to be increasingly important for the success of these units. Some of them are of a size that is either up to or smaller than a combined cycle unit, and there are a number of facilities I know in North America that could be adapted for producing many of these modules that would take a lot of the construction out of the field and get away from stick built. The second one is, I think there is a burgeoning movement that I'm working with that really recognizes we need to evaluate how we actually construct these facilities. There are a number of lessons learned around the world, France, Finland, the United States, and elsewhere, where we've run into trouble. Let's really take stock of that. Can we come up with new methodologies for digital twins, for better methodologies of deploying your workforce, really trying to avoid some of those challenges. And in light of these reactor designs being smaller, really try to speed up the deployment in such a way to make them more affordable.
Could I contrast just a little bit to that perspective? I mean, ironically, I'm an economist, right, and came from the Chicago school sort of in sort of philosophy. So I think I spent the first half of my career thinking the market was the solution to everything. But I think as it relates to nuclear technology, we really don't have time for the market to catch up and to go through the natural cycle. And so I actually, as it relates to government involvement, I think the government should not be squeamish. I think it's a completely rational thing to downsize to, you know, a rational number, 2 or 3 designs, and then use government procurement as a way to prime the pump. Particularly as we think about the situation with climate change and the timeline in front of us to begin to make a contribution for the nuclear industry. I think there's a strong case to be made from a policy perspective that now is the time not to wait for Adam Smith to come in and make the solution for us, but now is the time to make some decisions and then live with our decisions. But I think, you know, and this kind of comes back, you know, previous to being an economist, I was in the Army. One of the things they used to say to, you know, young soldiers in a tactical environment is, you know, any plan is almost always better than no plan. And I think that that's definitely the case we're in today.
Yeah, I cannot agree more to Dave. You know, government's role in the nuclear is, no, it's not because of in the market, but it's more national security, military implication, proliferation risk. So government should be involved. Otherwise, nuclear future doesn't exist. The vessels, the small reactor for the vessels, light water reactor for vessels is another solution. Submarines or aircraft carriers or icebreakers or barges like Russia is doing, that is one way for the future. But this is, again, the government procurement. So I think for the Fukushima, yes, definitely government should decide a type of the reactor and reprocessing to solve this debris issue. So government should decide really what is the future of the nuclear. Otherwise, market probably cannot solve. Just somebody said about the China case or Korea case or Russia case, government intervention is only the evidence that nuclear reactor can be built at least in these countries.
So I think I actually saw Mungo's hand go up first, before the first question. So, or right after the first question. So you first and then Dan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The only thing I know about is financing and innovation. I believe that the key part from the financing point of view of the topic here is the strength of the PPA. So if the strength of the PPA is sufficient, we'll always get it funded. So the question that I have is really which way should we be going and to what extent should we be pushing innovation? Because I don't know the answer to this question. What is or are the projected costs on a comparison basis between SMRs and with whatever fuel is going into it as we go forward over the next 3 or 4 years and advanced reactors from a cost per megawatt point of view? I agree absolutely what you said. We have a common enemy, Dave. We've got to address it now. We've got to move tomorrow. Waiting 10 or 15 years is too late. And so is there a real worth to wait for the advanced reactor route when actually it's now commercially viable to build now? What are the projected costs on SMRs versus advanced reactors on a megawatt basis, please?
I'm sure the rest of the panel have thoughts on this as well. And unfortunately, what I would say is there is a vast array of projections of what costs of both SMRs and advanced technologies will provide. My own perspective, which may not be shared by everybody, so to caveat to some extent, I use a rule of thumb when I think about technologies, which is around power density. The more materials you require, for the lesser amount of energy means the cost will go up. And in general, I think SMRs will have a power density that using light water SMRs will probably be lower than the large-scale reactors, and so the economics will tend to move against them. That's not necessarily, you know, a nail in the coffin, however, because in many of the places where we're looking for these small SMRs to be deployed, they're competing with, you know, diesel fuel that's trucked in or shipped in, and the economics of that power generation is extremely high. And so I think that's, you know, you have to think about the context of where you're deploying. So I don't think that means that those SMRs are uneconomic, but I don't think that they'll necessarily be the commercial answer in the long term. Although we may see with scale, if we produce 100 SMRs in the world and we become very expert at it, I mean, traditionally scale reduces cost by about 25%, right, over a certain number of iterations. We can see, you know, the possibility it could become economic, but we'll see that a little bit in the future. I think the advanced reactor designs going forward, particularly fast reactor designs, because they have a much higher thermal efficiency, because there's some physical reasons why that's the case, they hold the promise of potentially very low economics. You know, so-called molten salt, sodium fast reactors, others, they could potentially get to thermal efficiencies that are equivalent to combined cycle gas turbine plants.
But a price per megawatt? What do you...
On a price per megawatt basis, I think you could see potentially technologies that could get to 5 cents per kilowatt hour.
And SMR's not?
I haven't seen the SMR yet where I've been comfortable that number would actually be achieved. Of course, and as I say, advanced reactors are still further out, so there's a lot of uncertainty in those numbers. But as you say, the PPA is critical. I think, just to echo a point I made earlier, the government needs to treat nuclear power like it does other very advantageous sources of power by giving appropriate credit to that within PPAs, and government procurement that takes some of that technology risk first, and, you know, with a government-backed PPA to do that would be another thing. Related to that point also on PPAs that you make, which I think is really important, we have to stop thrusting nuclear technologies into merchant markets. It's not a good place for them. It's not the right place. I think a better solution for those markets would be, you know, a portfolio standard that included some amount of nuclear as a way to get to a more efficient outcome.
I'm bound by confidentiality and can't share it, but we are now working on a funding model which is around the PPA for renewables, which I think will be absolutely applicable here. And the largest financial organizations in the world are getting behind it. I'm very happy to share it with anybody that may be interested. Sorry for butting in.
Did you have anything to add? Jennifer seems to have stepped out. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm doing the thing that we were supposed to do yesterday, where the moderator walks around.
Look natural.
Right, exactly. So Romina, please go ahead.
No, I was going to see where the next question
Oh, no, I know that Dan had a question, so if you could pass the microphone.
Picks up on Nabuo's point. They say anytime your critic has a bumper sticker and you need a paragraph or more, you're in trouble. So I'd like this eminent panel to ask an answer to 2 bumper stickers. One is nuclear is unsafe. And we've all been asked this, and you can say, well, no one died at TMI, and 18,000 from Fukushima, but that was a tsunami and just one radiation. And Chernobyl's different, but that was really a Soviet issue, not in a react. So, you know, you're playing catch up. So, and the second one is, and we've heard it at this conference, you know, Lincoln Steffens, I've seen the future and it works. It's renewables. And they focus on the levelized cost of electricity. They don't take into account seasonal shifts. They don't take into account that there's no battery to, you know, address those issues and not likely to be one. And that even, you know, Varun Savaram in Taming the Sun will tell you, and MIT will tell you, that you get faster, cheaper to zero, which we need to do super fast, with a combination including dispatchable power and ideally with more load following. But again, this is a group that deals in the public all the time. How we are failing collectively. You said they're 10x better than us in terms of the debate. What are the best, because we get asked all the time, we need better talking points, and I want to ask our panelists if they can help us.
I'll give the others a chance to comment.
Well, first up, there's a tendency when we get together in these nuclear meetings to sort of look at the glass as being, you know, half empty rather than being half full. I actually think in comparison to where we are before, we've got a lot more people out there with bumper stickers saying we need more nuclear power. If you look at the number in the United States, the number of pro-nuclear NGOs who are out there talking about the importance of nuclear for climate change and the fact it is safe is really, really helpful. So that's one thing I would sort of put out there that I think is important.
And I'd like to bring a slightly different perspective on this, because last night I was asked about, do we just belabor the point that nuclear is safe? And it's a question of, I don't start a conversation by saying I'm honest, right? I mean, that's a given. And so why do we do that? But, what's interesting, I find, that's happening in the Canadian industry right now is sometimes you forget that they're in the business of generating electricity because all the promotional material is medical isotopes. Canada is now a leader in production of medical isotopes. And so a lot of the public relations is around that, or it's around climate change and how with our nuclear power plants, cleaner energy, ESMA rates have gone down and so forth. So there's less discussion around safety because over time it's just now a given, other than by the regulator.
I'm sorry. Dan, I forgot to answer the other half of your question, and that is, people say, well, we can put in all of these great renewable plants and get rid of other forms of energy. When you have to replace a 1,000-megawatt nuclear power plant, in order to replicate that with renewables, you have to basically put in 3,000 megawatts of renewables and a battery, or you need to put 1,000 megawatts of renewables that will operate 8 hours a day and a combined cycle unit that will operate the remainder of the day. And, oh, by the way, those assets operate 20 to 30 years. So to replicate that 80-year nuclear power plant, you're going to have 3 sets of kit or 4 sets of kit in order to do that. And people don't bake that in. So they're making an apples and oranges comparison. When you make a true apples and apples comparison, the total life cycle cost of producing 1,000 megawatts of power over 80 years, the numbers come in quite differently.
Just prove my point. You can't put it on a bumper sticker.
He has a very big car.
Dan's question is quite adequate, before Fukushima accident, Japan is very proud that our reactors are totally safe, no chance of having any accident, but we betrayed, I'm sorry, everybody. So human error could happen, and so that's the reason why I'm saying that the big light water reactor paradigm was successful until Fukushima, but no more the case. If the next accident happened, it could be in China, of course. They are building hell of a light water reactor. So if something wrong happens in China, this is a total end of the light water reactor system. So we rather say, okay, we have to extend our lives of the current light water reactor. That's fine. But not building any new big light water reactor, but developing the much smaller modular reactors, which is the risk is much smaller than big one. And passive safety in a technology could help to avoid the human error accident. And proliferation resistance, and difficult to make a weapon out of this. So smaller micro reactor is a very interesting concept which American military is developing. So more nuclear battery or nuclear small micro reactors, it will be the future. So to go that direction, small modular reactor is the next step. And if we can develop hundreds of them, maybe the cost is very effective. So we have to clearly show the public and everybody collectively that the big light water reactor age is over. That we have to say and admit clearly.
So just real quick to your first question about, is it safe? I think one of the things that we don't do well is we don't enunciate the difference between, we've had these accidents, and I did some analysis recently around this. I'm sure many of you have seen the Netflix program Chernobyl, which has been making the rounds of, leadership in this region, including some of my clients, who'd asked me to sort of do a look at that and, what was fact and what was fiction. And, I think, World Health Organization, the UN, others conclude that ultimately, the Chernobyl accident might result in something, north of about 9,000, early deaths from cancers, which is a huge number. right? But let me give you another number. If you'd had a coal plant operating for the same capacity over 60 years, the death toll would be 54,000 people, right? Almost 6x, right? So I think one of the things that we need to talk about is the industry, and of course it's not comfortable because most utilities have nuclear plants and conventional plants, right? Is that we're contributing to much larger fatalities in a much slower timeline with other technologies, right? But we've got to be honest about the safety of nuclear power, even in its accident forms, right? The worst scenarios, Chernobyl and Fukushima, its performance on safety has been better than the traditional conventional hydrocarbon forms by a large margin. And we have to communicate that more effectively, right? And so, I don't know what the right, bumper sticker is. It's safer than coal. I don't know, maybe. But we have to find the right one. But to put that last number in context too, we did a calculation for the Baraka project here, right? And I, sort of looked at if we had gone the route that we were going before we launched the program, we were going to build crude-fired power here. That would have been the solution. It's what's been done in the GCC in general. If you look at the fatality rates per gigawatt hour or terawatt hour of crude-fired power generation, if the Baraka plants operate for 60 years, and if they're operating in lieu of crude-fired power generation, there will be a little more than 100,000 people here at the end of that 60 years that wouldn't have been here otherwise, which I think is a really powerful statement, right? And one of the reasons why this country's embraced this technology.
So go ahead, Romina. No. Okay. Dave, that was a good argument, but I don't think that fits on a bumper sticker either.
Oh, so I think, I've heard nuclear is cool, but I like nuclear is clean. That's a good bumper sticker, I think.
Nuclear is clean. I think that works as far as I'm concerned. Yes.
Hi, my name is Omar Alzabi. I'm a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley. I just want to go back to your comment about government intervention. I think we're going to have a lot more trouble trying to account for positive externalities of nuclear compared to negative externalities of power generation overall. And so I just wonder whether what seems to be an informal alliance between the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry is slowing the nuclear industry down.
So make sure I understand your question. So is the question, is the nuclear industry and the fossil fuel industry somehow in league, or what's the exact question? I'm sorry.
It's harder to quantify the positive externalities of nuclear compared to quantifying negative externalities of power generation overall.
Well, I'll disagree as an economist. I think the positive externalities are completely quantifiable in terms of, avoided CO2, avoided SOx and NOx, fatalities. You can turn it into life numbers. You can turn it into cost. In the same way that we quantify the positive externalities of solar and wind, the same models, right, can ultimately be used. But it does take an effort. Now, as it relates to some, league between nuclear and conventional, I think that nuclear energy producers need to stop apologizing about being critical of the fossil fuel industry. I think, that's one of the reasons why our marketing is not good. We're quite, have quite a bit of decorum in utility settings, and I think we have to abandon some of that.
Yeah, I agree with Dave, and I'd add two things. I think there's a good example, Romina might be able to talk about it, of a major study that was done in Ontario that demonstrated that their decision to go to 100% carbon-free, which is a combination of nuclear, hydro, and other assets, led to a dramatic reduction in the number of asthmas and had very positive health consequences and a reduction in the cost of medical care in Ontario as a result of that decision. So I think there are results out there that you could point to say that there are real benefits to be had here. Now, in terms of the fight, I can tell you it's a much different situation in the United States. There was, in my view, a very well thought out strategy on the part of the natural gas industry to call itself clean, to embrace renewables, because they are a major source of generation to back up those intermittent sources when they're not operating because of weather or because of lack of sunlight. In addition, the natural gas industry in the United States has made a very active effort to try to get a number of nuclear power plants shut down so that they can build combined cycles to backfill it. So the notion that there's some kind of a peace agreement between the nuclear industry and oil and gas, at least in the United States, that is not at all the case.
So I think we have time for one more quick question, Branko, and then we'll have a few quick answers before we wrap.
Very quickly, I have a bumper sticker. Jeff was a safety regulator. I was an economic regulator as a state commissioner regulating Point Beach and Kewanee nuclear power plants. And you may not be aware of it, but I understand now licenses have gone out to 80 years, and economic regulators do not have to limit their depreciation rates to the license life. They can go beyond it. I just had a court case in a hydroelectric for that. So I'm thinking a nice bumper sticker could be good for 80 years.
Oh, one more question?
Thank you, Jen. I have a question to Ms. Welshi. You've mentioned the memorandum of cooperation you have set with the US NRC. So I just wonder if you have started some talks with WENRA and if you intend to have such cooperation, memorandum of cooperation with European regulators, such as the French one or another one. Thank you.
And I know part of the topic for today's was international harmonization, and it really gets to that. What we've done with what the CNSC and the US NRC has done is kind of a baby step towards how do we get greater international collaboration. So there are other nuclear regulators who want to join hands with us, France, the UK in particular. But I think what I'd like us to really consider even more seriously, and it's to address something that Dave said when he talked about licensing fees and first-of-kind risks, that really for SMRs, I believe, to really succeed, they need to be produced in bulk. It's this one standard design that will be produced en masse. And that can only happen if you've got international regulatory requirements that are consistent so that you can have that one consistent design. And in order to have that happen, you need to have the harmonization of requirements. And so there are agencies like the IAEA, the NEA, the WNA, all have shown interest. I think the WNA has actually put together a white paper on that based on surveys that they have done of industry, of regulators, of suppliers, and so on, to see how we can move ahead with that. And if you look at industries like the aircraft industry, or even within our own backyard, what we do with transportation flasks and containers, it is, if one regulator has approved it, then others will accept it, provided they've made sure that, there's a quality assurance program in place. So I think the future really is that in order for SMRs to really succeed and have mass production.
If I can add, because Romina probably can't be she has to be more diplomatic than I need to be. When I was an NRC commissioner, we went about in 2006, 2007, trying to have a multilateral international design evaluation process that included members of WENRA, it included Canada, the US. There was a whole group of regulators that got in there, and it failed. It just failed. It was too many people around the room. And what really needs to happen, and I credit Romina and her counterpart, Christine Savinicki, the chairman of the NRC, said, let's start small. Let's get two countries that can agree on a common standard. We've got a common set of reactors we're going to take a look at. Let's build some success with that. If they can make that happen, then begin to bring in other countries, England, others who have similar mind, and sort of adapt it as a process. Because I think going and trying to get a whole bunch of people in the room has shown to be not an effective strategy.
So I think we actually have to end here. I want to thank all of our speakers, and thank you all for being such an engaged audience. And I think that what we did here really successfully was get from how we finance nuclear energy and also how we regulate it, to why we're doing it, which is because we all believe in a clean energy future. And so I think this is a really great segue into the next session, which will be downstairs in the El Mudeif Ballroom on environmental, social, and corporate governance. So please join me there, which is happening, I think, right now. Thank you.